Why do we admire handsome and powerfully built actors like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Ronald Reagan, and then elect them to public office? Why do we prefer tall males as president? Why do leaders who are ill or in wheelchairs, like FDR or JFK, seek to hide images of that state of ill health, even when their minds have not been affected? And why do we idolize heroic and handsome quarterbacks like Tom Brady? Besides the issues of politics and rhetoric, there is a human impulse which has us look to leaders who embody virility, vigor, and allure. This was especially true in ancient societies in which leaders were also warriors. In fact, what we might define as allure and charisma, along with physical perfection, were necessities for a Mesopotamian leader. Or at least the ruler could represent himself that way. When we look at the Stela of Naram in this lecture, we will see how the Akkadian king of circa 2250 BC made it his conscious strategy to have himself depicted as a perfect, alluring, and manly ruler. It's as if he campaigned to be both ruler and god. We gaze upon an oversized man who has a perfect and athletic body, broad of chest, long of beard, and lithe but strongly muscled. Naram Sin conformed to Mesopotamian ideas of what a god or leader should look like. In the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is a semi-divine hero who is described as being well-built and having vitality, goodness, vigor, and sex appeal, or allure. Gilgamesh was an alpha male and a legendary ruler of the ancient city of Uruk. The image and description of the hero Gilgamesh could have been the model for the artist who carved this stela, for Naram Sin wanted to have all those qualities too. As king, and as one who declared himself divine, it's thought that he absolutely needed to have this vigor and manliness. He wanted to be the dominant male, and he needed to show it in a way that the populace would buy. The Akkadian language had a word for allure, which included sexiness and charisma. It was kuzbu, and it was this quality which the gods and particular people possessed. The virility of the leader was vital to the society. It needed to be demonstrated. The Assyrian king, Akkad1 declared, "I am a lion and I am a potent male," just to make this obvious, in text as well as art. And so we see lots of metaphors that compare rulers to large and aggressive animals, mainly lions, but also bulls, and it seems like quaint bragging and self-aggrandizement to us. Or maybe not so quaint if you consider today's politicians and sports figures. We find these metaphors in literature and also in the art. In ancient Mesopotamian society, the strategy of using grand metaphors in text and art was used to better position the ruler, and in this case, to make him appear divine. In the last lecture, we looked at a magnificent building that was a unique type characteristic of the Mesopotamians. We examined the ziggurat at Ur, and it gave us some sense of the religious life of the Sumerians. The temple was a large and central symbol of the city's god. It was also a vital part of the city's economy and community life. For rulers, the building of a city's temple was truly considered a necessary duty. But a temple could also serve as a monument proclaiming the ruler's piety and his power. Today, we are going to look at another art object which depicts the role of the ruler in Mesopotamia. It's a groundbreaking piece because it had the audacity to change that role. A ruler claims here that he is divine. And not only does it show a ruler as divine, the artwork uses a new way of depicting a story. So we will see a new form of ruler and a new style for the art. The question in this lecture is, what makes a king a god? Essentially, a whole lot of propaganda. And some of that is visual. We'll look at this one example, which happens to be extremely significant and extraordinary in the artistic sense. It's called the Victory Stela of Naram, and it dates to the time of King Naram-Sin's rule in Mesopotamia, probably 2254 to 2218 BC. The Stela of Naram-Sin is one of our first monumental historic documents. It's also the first time that we see a Mesopotamian king present himself as a god. He's shown here in battle as a heroic leader. It's not the first time we've seen a Mesopotamian ruler represented as a leader in battle. Think back to the Standard of Ur. Think of Washington crossing the Delaware as depicted in art. In the famous painting created in 1851 by Emanuel Leutze, we see the heroic figure of George Washington. He is the largest and tallest figure in the boat. A triangular arrangement helps focus on the leader who looks off to the distance. His wide stance, a confident one, while his soldiers struggle with the boat. The soldiers propel the boat and the action forward. The American flag echoes the diagonals of the oars and of Washington himself. Washington is surrounded by a nimbus of light, which appears to make him glow with divine light against the clouds. This leader of the army, a general and future president, is shown in a risky and dangerous battle, which involved conquering the elements of nature. In this case, they are the icy water of a river and the cold of winter. Washington was successful in this battle, and he was commemorated here quite a few decades later. He's shown as brave, courageous, risk-taking, and handsome in his military garb and formal headgear. He is larger than life. The paintings of Washington have become, in a sense, a part of the narrative history of the United States of America. They have been reproduced and copied by other paintings, and a sonnet was even written about Larry Rivers' version of the painting. He's a 20th century artist, the father of pop art. These sorts of images reinforce the founding legend of America. The pride and glory that these paintings evoke visually become part of the patriotic fervor of the U.S. These kinds of visual reminders help us to be Americans and to respect leaders of our country. And as you know, our presidents and many world leaders like to clothe themselves in flags and associate themselves with their victorious armies. So this sort of thing has a very long history. You'll see just how long as we continue. Now let's turn to the Naram-Sin Stela. It seeks to do a similar thing as the Washington painting. This time, though, the ruler himself was probably the one who commissioned it. Who was Naram-Sin? Naram-Sin was the grandson of the founder of the dynasty of Akkad, Sargon the Great, about 2300 BC. The Akkadians were a Semitic-speaking group who were predominant slightly to the north, but had been a part of the population for an unknown time in the land of Sumer to the south. The Akkadians expanded their scope through battle and conquered enough land to be called an empire. Their language became the primary one. We often refer to Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium as the land of Sumer and Akkad. War was central to the Akkadians' power, and they created the largest empire then known. For the first time, remarkably, all of Mesopotamia, with its varied lands, was united under one king. Incidentally, Naram-Sin's aunt was the high priestess of the god Nana at Ur, whom we mentioned in the last lecture. She was Enheduanna, the first poet and author to have her name attached to literature. Naram Sin was the mightiest ruler of the kingdom of Akkad. The empire reached its peak under his reign. The capital of Akkad, a city called Akkad1, has unfortunately never been found. We don't have as much monumental art or architecture from this period since much was destroyed or lost. Naram Sin expanded his empire greatly and celebrated his victories by commemorating them with Stela, large stone monuments, usually carved on both sides and with a rounded top. At least that's what his predecessors did. Naram Sin broke with precedent, though. He declared himself as divine during his lifetime. We know this for sure from an inscription on another statue. This was a new idea of kingship. During his reign, he called himself King of the Four Quarters, King of the Universe. That's an epithet that we'll see once again in the Assyrian Empire. Naram Sin was a daring king. He wanted to proclaim his divinity in stone. He needed to show that he was a divine king, but still doing an earthly leader's job, such as in battle. So he needed a new visual vocabulary in order to show this novel status in the art, which aggrandized him. Remember, writing was a fairly new innovation, and most people were illiterate at this time. The stela we see here does just that. It shows Naram Sin's divine status and his heroic majesty. It's startlingly innovative, even though it's hard for us as modern people to imagine that something like this imagery had to be invented. Invented they did. Some of the greatest art and greatest stylistic innovations of ancient times were created in the short time, approximately 2 centuries, that the Akkadians were in power. Now, it's important to understand that all along in Mesopotamian art, there was a polarity, as Henri Frankfurt puts it. He was the great Mesopotamian art scholar who first wrote the book on this subject. Frankfurt contended that Mesopotamians had a tension between the love of design for its own sake and, on the other hand, a delight in physical reality. Akkadian art veers towards the latter. It's robust, muscular, and reality-based. Naram Sin had this particular stela made to commemorate his victory in battle over the Lullaby. The Lullaby were a group of people who lived to the east in the Zagros Mountains. They lived in what is today western Iran. In fact, the rivalry and warfare between the peoples of what is today Iran and Iraq has its roots many millennia ago. This bold ruler had a 6.5-foot monument made of stone erected in the city of Sippar. It was probably set up in a temple of Sippar, but we don't know for sure. Later rulers seemed to covet it, and it was looted from its original site. It was also reproduced, but not as well, on rock cliffs elsewhere. Naram Sin's artist has thrown away the template used to organize battle scenes before. As you remember, the standard of Ur neatly organized the scenes of battle into registers and a narrative of motion that unrolled the event. Here in this later stela, the artist has taken a plunge into a new pictorial reality. He's unified the whole battle into one undivided composition. This scene is now set in what seems to be a real landscape, one that is unified and coherent. It's also more realistic or naturalistic in style. If you look at the tree, it even resembles the ones you would find in the mountainous area to the east. And instead of the strong horizontals and rhythmic elements that we've seen before, the scene is represented with strong diagonal elements. This makes it much more dramatic, even emotionally evocative. The diagonals imply movement. This use of diagonals is something that you also see frequently in dramatic, historic scenes painted in Western art. Think of these, Rembrandt and Rubens, using the diagonal in scenes from the Bible to heighten the tension and drama. Note that we also have this pyramidal composition in our stela. Naram Sin strides triumphant at the top. His stance is wide, like Washington's. This is, in fact, the stance of a winner. It conveys dominance. The king is the picture of confident leadership in battle. He carries his weapons with bold assurance, a bow, an axe, and an arrow. Even his bent elbows make him larger and more confident. If you look closely, the body of Naram Sin is real here, muscular, masculine, and in action. Note that his physique is well modeled. He's a perfect specimen of a warrior. His calf muscles and biceps bulge, and his torso is robustly modeled. He has a long and manly beard. Even his gluteus maximus is portrayed as athletic and strong, and it's emphasized by his tied garment. He looks vigorous and virile. He conveys the power of his body in this image by looking heroic and strong. He's also larger than all the other men, and the stela shows only men. And he's surrounded by space, which serves to make him the center of attention. He alone confronts the divine by placing himself next to the steep mountain and closest to the divine symbols at the top. He's the focus of the scene, and we know he is divine because he wears the Mesopotamian symbol of divinity, the horned helmet. Naram Sin strides upwards, and his soldiers march behind and under him in organized diagonals. They are relentless. They confront the hapless Lulubi, who are, in contrast, disorganized. You can see that the Lulubi enemies are different from the helmeted Akkadian warriors, as shown by their pigtails and goatees. An enemy soldier is crushed, bent and broken beneath Naram Sin's feet. Another enemy, kneeling before him, tries to pull the spear from his neck, looking as if he begs for mercy in his pitiful pose, a pose which echoes the diagonals as well in the posture and the spear. Other disorganized and pathetic-looking Lulubi are placed on the right half of the composition. They seem to be beseeching to be spared an awful fate. A wonderfully rendered tree, not a generic one, breaks up their mass and interrupts their beseeching gestures. One gets the feeling that this relentless military force, identically dressed, is led by a god-king of such great force and power that anything is possible. The actual motion in the scene is upward and onward. Over the mountain they go. Now note that rather than a rounded top, the stone relief is triangular in shape. It was damaged and broken off to some extent. But the general triangular sloping shape is not typical of Mesopotamian stelae. This innovation reinforces the newness and force of the composition. The unified field and narrowing shape focuses on the king. For perhaps the first time in art, we have a large unified landscape scene, a historical narrative that is told in one bold stroke, rather than the unrolling of registers that came before. What a masterful work. In fact, this work of art was so potent as a symbol of power and had such artistic value that it was looted by the Elamite king, Shutruk-Nahunte, and taken as war booty to Susa in Iran in the 12th century BC, 1,000 years after it was made. It was even written on by the Elamites. The stela was discovered at Susa by the French archaeological expedition which excavated there. It's now in the Louvre Museum, and it's one of the greatest works of ancient art there or anywhere in the world. Why? Because of the artistic skill used in modeling the physique of the warriors and the king, and the very effective new manner of composing the scene. Beyond that, the art reflects the Akkadian period's deep artistic creativity, which is one of the high points in the history of art. In fact, versions of this stela were carved in huge rock reliefs at 3 other sites in the western Zagros. So it was acknowledged even in its own time as a singularly effective and majestic work of art. Let's look closely at 2 aspects of the artwork in the context of their time: the role of the king and the new approach to narrative. The king, as we know from the standard of Ur, was already depicted larger than life in some of the earliest art. The Sumerians had developed a new visual vocabulary for denoting kingship. This consisted of a characteristic coiffure of kingship. You can see it here in one of the earliest of Mesopotamian images. In very early times, around 3100 BC, the king wears his hair in a thick plait around his head. It looks a little like a rolled-up brim of a cap with a chignon in back. The ruler in this early stone relief is shown victorious as well. In this stela, he's killing lions, a sort of enemy. A few centuries later, we see that in the royal cemetery of Ur, that this helmet has incorporated the form of this distinctive headwear. Even though the Akkadian dynasty marks a break in political control with the Sumerians who came before, the Akkadians still try to use some of the same Sumerian vocabulary of kingship. So we can see this sort of headgear in Akkadian times as well. Here is one of the best-known works of Akkadian metalwork, and it is celebrated for its technical skill in metal casting. It's believed to show an Akkadian ruler, either Naram or Sargon. But more importantly for us, it shows us the artistic skill of the time. Artists are depicting a man with sensitive, individual modeled features, a man who seems both majestic and awe-inspiring. You can see that the elaborate plaited hair around his head is modeled after the Sumerian insignia of kingship. He also wears the chignon. His luxuriant beard is carefully modeled down to its individual ringlets, and the smooth and sensitive modeling of the cheeks shows more of an individual than a generic man. The difference between the more generic look of the Sumerian rulers and this Akkadian head is vast in a stylistic sense. Just look at the way these lips are modeled. They're thick and sensuous and very naturalistic. It's quite a contrast with the arched, stylized eyebrows. The eyes were gouged out in antiquity, probably by an enemy, but they would have had realistic-looking inlays of another material. But Naram Sin chose a new approach to signifying his new conception of kingship. In order to depict himself as a divine being, he donned the helmet with horns that you see in the Victory Stela. He must be the first king to have done so. Horns were used from the earliest times in the ancient Near East to indicate a figure's divine status. It was a shorthand way to know exactly what you were looking at. That's something that the Greeks discarded because they wanted the gods to reflect humans. If you go back to the Neolithic age, in fact, one can see that horns already had a mythic or divine role in society. Here, at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, you can see the altar with horns that seems to be our first surviving example of the use of horns in a religious context. It dates to somewhere around 5,000 or 6,000 BC. We can surmise that the original wild bull, an aurochs, now extinct, was large dangerous, and feared. It may have been its power which the ancient artists wished to evoke when they crowned the first gods with this insignia. In any case, Naram takes a daring step in the Stela. He gives himself these horns of divinity. He has elevated himself and proclaimed his new status to the populace. You can see that later, not all kings were apt to consider themselves divine. Here in the famous law code of Hammurabi, about 1750 BC, the king appears before the sun god Shamash with no such crown. He wears the cap of kingship, and the god wears the multiple horned crown which most Mesopotamian divinities wore. Hammurabi pays obeisance to the god. His posture is more static, and the action is gone from the stela, which was made in the old Babylonian period. At that time, some of the arresting variety and fresh take on art had disappeared. The era seemed to prefer duller, more conventional scenes of adoration in its art. So the Akkadian period was indeed a unique and special time for artistic experimentation. Just to give you some sense of how things changed on a smaller scale Akkadian object, let's look at this wonderful cylinder seal from Boston's Museum of Fine Arts. You can see in this tiny field that a coherent scene with action is shown. We have a hunt taking place in mountainous terrain, and the hunters are chasing different kinds of animals. This small scene is so compelling because it is unified and specific. Unlike earlier cylinder seals, which were carved to mostly show decorative patterns and friezes of combatants or temple events, this one puts the action into a specific-looking place and uses the totality of the space to indicate some sort of depth of field. Perspective was not something that Mesopotamian artists employed, nor did Egyptians most of the time. They knew of foreshortening, but it didn't serve their purposes. As you can see in the Naram Stela, the communication of a message about the king and his role was paramount, and nothing could interfere with that. The specifics of a battle could be shown, but the idea of using art to create an illusion of reality was not something that appealed to them. More importantly, the narrative of defeat of an enemy was tweaked here, so that the broken bodies of the individual enemies seemed to locate the action in more specific time. If we go back to the standard of Ur, we remember that the enemy bodies lay nude beneath the onagers' galloping feet. The idea of depicting the enemy underfoot and in such a state of defeat or death is practically universal. Many Andean cultures did this, as did the Maya. And in Egypt, it was de rigueur to show the enemies of the pharaoh beneath his feet on an endless series of monuments. Such attempts to humiliate the enemy are not unknown in our time. Just think of the soldiers desecrating the bodies of their enemies and then taking pictures. And depicting the enemy nude is one aspect of that humiliation. In fact, lines of prisoners being marched nude to some sort of not very pleasant fate pops up everywhere. Here in a small Akkadian stela, and here in an adobe relief on a Mochehuaca in Peru. There was no communication between these cultures. A universal language of loss and humiliation, death and defeat seems to have developed similarly in many places in the world. While this examination of the role of kingship and its push for innovation in art, we will come to something even more grand and majestic. We'll skip to the first millennium BC and to the famed Assyrian Empire. Using many similar symbols and conventions, the Assyrians reach a pinnacle of narrative art in the Assyrian palace reliefs. Their skill in stone carving was unparalleled. We'll be looking at some of the greatest masterpieces of art, not just from ancient times, but any time. These artists not only had skill, but a manner of conveying the emotions of animals, the sacred world of the empire, and the actual battles that they were asked to illustrate. All were, like the victory stela of Naram, part of the visual propaganda which set the Assyrian king apart from the rest of humanity and gave him the legitimacy to govern, to wage war, and to wield power over his subjects.